Hi there, everybody. This is Pastor Charlie joining you from the parsonage this morning, which of course will be a surprise if you are at 8 o'clock or at 9:15 worship today. You will, of course, have been expecting me to be with you, but that is clearly not the case. I have had a direct contact with someone who was exposed to a confirmed COVID case during the week. And as I became aware of that, I have decided, out of an abundance of caution, of course, not to be among you all this morning and take any risk in that way. This has been a hope-filled week in terms of COVID-19 and the welcome of vaccinations into our world. There's light at the end of the tunnel. We don't want to drop any ball now that we have in our hands. And so out of that abundance of caution, as I've said, I'm going to preach to you from home this morning. And so I want to tell you about what life was like whenever I was a wee boy back home in Northern Ireland. You see, when I was there, Northern Ireland really was not the kind of place that many tourists liked to come to at all. It had a name as a divided and violent society, and it put off so many people from coming to see the beauty of the place. Now, thankfully, it's not that way anymore, of course. But it also put off any major bands or performers from coming to Belfast to ply their trade. And so we did not always have those opportunities to see top performers doing their thing like people in the other cities of the United Kingdom and Ireland might have had. But there was always one exception to that rule. I mean, there's always an exception to the rule, right? The Mary Peters Athletics track. Every year in that place, the Northern Ireland Amateur Athletics Association hosted a track and field meeting which attracted some of the biggest names in European and in world athletics. Some of you may remember a runner by the name of Ed Moses. He was an American, a world champion, a world record holder. He came to run in Belfast during those very years. Anyway, it was around 1990, and the time had come again for this annual meeting to take place, and my friend, his dad, had managed to bag some tickets. My friend invited me to come along with his family that night and to sit with them and to watch the event. And I got a little bit excited. You see, I was a bit of an athletics fanboy. When I was a kid, I liked nothing more than to sit down and watch those track and field meetings as they were on the television. I knew all of the stars in all of the events. And so the thought of going along to the Mary Peters track to see this event in person got me a little bit excited. Well, then I found out one of the athletes that was going to be there. It was a sprinter by the name of Linford Christie. Now, at the time, Christie was certainly the fastest man in the UK and in Europe, and he was on his way to winning Olympic gold in the 100 metres in 1992 at Barcelona. He was a big star, and he was probably my favourite runner of the moment. So I was doubly excited, not only that I was going along to this athletics meeting anyway, but I was going to get to see my favourite runner in person. And so I decided that not only would I go and see him racing live, but I would also make sure that I took my autograph book and that I would find an opportunity to get him to sign it for me. So the event came. Christie came out, warmed up, stretched, raced. He won his race convincingly that night, and he did the thing that you would expect. He waved at the crowd and he smiled and he took his lap of honour. And as he took that lap of honour, my friend and I, well, we sprinted over to the area of the arena where Linford Christie would make his exit. And we joined the group of other young fans, all of us around the same age, and we were excited at the thought of getting to meet our hero. Well, we saw him approaching from a distance, and the excitement amongst us grew even more. Oh, there he is, there he is. We were pointing to try and make sure everyone knew that he was on his way. And he got closer and closer, and as he approached the crowd, we got even more excited, and then, well, you know what? He just walked through us. not even looking at us. He did not stop. He did not talk. He didn't even make eye contact with us. He just walked through, handing out some pre-prepared picture postcards to those fans who were gathering around him. I'll not lie to you, church. My 11-year-old heart was shattered. And I was utterly disappointed, because that which I had built up as an amazing moment in my long life to that point, those whole 11 years, well, it turned out to be the complete opposite of what I expected and what I hoped. You know, a similar thing is said to have happened to the 16th century reformer Martin Luther. Before sparking the Protestant Reformation, Luther had been a devoted adherent to the Roman Catholic tradition, serving in a monastery in Germany. He was amazed and enthused by the faith and had what we might now call a little bit of an obsession with Rome. You see, as far as he was concerned, Rome was the holy city. It was the mother place of the church, and the things that happened there in Rome were tinged with a special sense of holiness for Martin Luther. He loved the place so much that he could not wait to make his own pilgrimage to it one day. Well, that day eventually came in the year 1510, and he made his way there, excited to take in the sights and the sounds and the ecclesiastical heights of this holy place. But when he got there, he became utterly disappointed, because all he found there was corruption, opulent extravagance, and a sense that Mother Church had completely lost her way. He was dismayed by the entire experience. Something that he had built up so much in his mind ended up being the polar opposite in reality. When Isaiah is writing these words in the 61st chapter of his prophecy, he is writing for a group of people who are disappointed, a group of people who have failed to have their hopes and expectations of a moment met. How so, you might ask? Well, this section of Isaiah's work is written in the early stages of the post-exile period in Israel's story. You may or may not know that in 597 BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had attacked Jerusalem, and the great city had fallen. Nebuchadnezzar took all that he could from the city, including the people, and he took it all back to Babylon. And those people were held there in exile for the next 50 years, away from their home, away from their city. This piece that we are reading here today is written just after that exile period, when the people of Israel are now starting to make their way back home. For 50 years they have been away. In fact, the generation that had once lived there and who could remember old Jerusalem in all of her old glory, well, they were no longer alive. But they had told the stories and passed those stories on to their children and to their children's children, to the very ones who were now getting ready to go home. And so their sense of expectation and excitement was completely heightened. Finally, they were going to get to see Jerusalem for themselves. They were going to experience its greatness firsthand. But when they got there, they very quickly realized that the early rebuilding efforts in Jerusalem, well, they had not built it up to its former glory at all. Their homecoming experience had been completely dampened by what they were seeing, and that their hopes then for what their city could and should be, their hopes for who they could and should be as a people, well, they had been completely dashed by what they were seeing on their return home. Have you ever had that kind of experience? You know, where your expectations have not been met, where you have been disappointed, where your hopes have been left in tatters because the reality that you are seeing and experiencing in any given moment has been such a disappointment and is so far from what you imagined it might have been. That's the experience of the people of Israel as they make their way home after 50 long years away. And these are the people that the prophet Isaiah is trying to get through to with this message of great hope. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me because he has appointed me to bring good news. The prophet had been called and appointed to be the bearer of good news to these people who were devastated, disappointed, and whose hopes had been dashed. These people who had experienced their own oppression whilst in exile, these people whose hearts had been broken by their experiences in their world and their losses, these people who had literally been captives in a foreign land. The prophet is called to be the one who brings to them the great news of hope, that those who are in mourning, well, they're going to be comforted. That those who are in mourning in Zion, Zion meaning the holy city, Zion meaning Jerusalem, that those who are in mourning in Jerusalem are going to receive a garland on their head instead of ashes. Now, you've got to understand that ashes were a sign of grief and loss. To wear ashes on your head was to signify that you were in a season of mourning. The prophet is addressing those who still feel the loss of their home. And the prophet is saying to them, hold on. Hold on. You who are in mourning, hold on. Because God is going to remove these ashes of mourning, the ashes of your grief, and is going to replace them with a garland of praise, with the oil of gladness. God is going to do this in God's people because, regardless of what they've lost, regardless of their disappointment in the midst of their return home, they are still the people of God, and as such, they are still a called people. A call to what? These people are called to be oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord to display his glory in the world is what we read in our Bibles. The job of being God's people was not about how beautiful the city was or how grandiose or ornate the buildings were. No, the job of the people of God was to display the glory of God. To be those oaks of righteousness, to be people who act justly and who do what is right in the world around them, caring for their neighbours. And in being these people, they will engage in the work of building up the fallen city, of rebuilding the ancient ruins, and of raising up the devastations that have taken place in the past. I mean, it's good news, right? I wonder, can you hear it? I mean, can you really hear it, church? The prophet was speaking to a broken and disappointed people for whom life had been dramatically changed and who were now struggling to remember who and what they had been called to be. And he was saying to them that they were not to forget hope. That they were not to forget the hope that is found in the God whom they worshipped and with whom they were in covenant. They were not to forget hope. They were to embrace it. They were to let themselves be empowered by it so that even in the ruins of their home, even in the midst of their disappointment and grief and loss, even in the midst of all that, they might continue to be the people of God, embodying and proclaiming the hope of God, and in doing so, rebuilding those very ruins that they stood among, rebuilding the destruction which had devastated them so. You see, when we forget hope, well, as people, we have a tendency to mope. And when we mope, we get nothing done. And even worse, we forget all sense of who and what we have called to be in the world. But make no mistake, my friends, the people of God, we are still a called people. We are still called to be oaks of righteousness and justice in the world. We're still called to be bearers of hope in the world, both in our words and in our actions. We are still called to continue the ministry of Jesus Christ in this world. And how did Jesus define his own ministry in the world? Well, If you know the Gospel of Luke, maybe you'll remember chapter 4, where Jesus stands up in the synagogue on a Sabbath morning, unrolls the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and reads these exact same words that we have read together this morning. That is the defining manifesto of the ministry of Jesus. And it's the ministry that you and me are called to continue in this very day. It was a manifesto of justice and righteousness. And that's the manifesto that we are called to live out today through hope-filled actions carried out by a people of God who have not forgotten our hope. That's our testimony. A testimony that was, that is, and forevermore will be pure and unadulterated hope, regardless of what's going on in the world around us. So the people who were gathered in a once glorious city that had now been left in ruins, those were God's people, and they were called to embody hope. People who had experienced devastating losses, even in that context, those were God's people, and they were called to embody hope. And even in the midst of a new normal that they found themselves in back in the day of Isaiah, in this new normal that we find ourselves in now, where a preacher is preaching late on a Saturday night to a church gathered the next Sunday morning, even in the midst of a new normal, we are still called to be God's people who embody the hope of God in the world through our hope-filled actions and our hope-filled words. You see, hope embodied through actions of justice and righteousness, that hope is a gift to the world. And when we live that hope out, church, that witness of those actions and of those words, that will be an example. And these hope-filled actions will become the defining mark, not only of our own generation that we are living in, but also of the generations to come. That's what the prophet says to these broken people in their home city, facing the devastation of the past, facing the ruins that they can still see before their very eyes. The prophet is saying to them, hey guys, don't forget hope. Don't forget to be hope. Don't forget to act in hope. Don't forget to speak hope. Because as you do, it will define who you are now, and it will define your people for generations to come. You see, that's the good news today, friends. Here we are in this third week of Advent now. Still talking about hope. Still trying to convince ourselves not to forget hope. Still having our hearts lit up with words of hope. And today we hear a call to a hope that becomes action in our world. So let's remember that manifesto of Jesus, my friends. The Jesus who we are looking for in these next couple of weeks, the Jesus who will arrive and whose birth we will celebrate on the 24th of December, the Jesus who we give our lives to day in and day out, Jesus from whom we receive this great hope that I'm talking about now. Let's be his people who embody that hope in the world, who proclaim it without shame or embarrassment, and who offer it as a gift to all of those who are experiencing brokenness, all of those who are mourning and grieving, all of those who need an injection of hope in their lives today. Let us be the ones that can give it. You see, that's what grace-filled people do. That's what the Church of Jesus Christ does. We fall into line with the ministry of Jesus, and we continue it to this day. A ministry of great hope, of great anticipation for all the things that God is doing in our midst right now, and that God will continue to do years into the future. So church, let's bring this strange sermon in this strange time to a close by being reminded once more of the hope that the prophets spoke of thousands of years ago. The hope that was embodied in the Christ child whose arrival we will celebrate in just 2 weeks' time. Of the hope that we are called to proclaim and to embody and to embrace in this world. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.